The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello, everyone.
So, Beth, we had a good time this past weekend at the 5th Annual Whitehall, New York Sasquatch Festival.
We did. It was a beautiful drive along Lake Champlain to get there, and Whitehall is a really lovely little town.
Yeah, there were about 75 vendors or so, and it was cool to see all the different footprint casts. Some of them had, like the Patterson-Gimlin footprint cast. And one of the vendors had a footprint cast of the Honey Island Swamp Monster that we covered in our earlier episode.
I was so excited to see that one. And we looked at the cast online before we did the episode, but it was just so cool to see an actual one in real life.
Yeah, it sure was.
And there was this gorgeous Gothic castle-like home up on the mountainside that looked down over the entire town. And we had no idea what it was, so we asked one of the local police officers who was doing security, and he was really kind and personable, and he told us some of the history about it. So I've got the details, and I think it could be a potential story down the line because, of course, they say it's haunted.
Yeah, that place was pretty ominous, the way it was up on the side of the mountainside like that, just looking down over the whole town.
It was really, really cool looking.
Well, it was a fun time, and I hope to do it again next year.
Me too.
You know, and to do some housekeeping, I'd also like to say that we've been getting contacted by numerous sponsors wanting to advertise on our show. You know, I don't have a problem with doing advertising, but we don't want to run a bunch of ads on our podcasts, nor do we want to advertise products that we don't personally use. You know, I can honestly say we lick our own stamps to send items out.
We lick our own stamps? Nobody licks their own stamps anymore. They're adhesive, like stickers.
Okay, well, I'll tell you this. Last time I sent anything out by the mail, I licked my own stamp. That was quite a few years ago.
Apparently.
I mean, usually I just take everything to the post office and I had them send it out for me, or you do it.
Right.
So you're not licking stamps.
No.
Well, then I don't have to worry about getting rid of you like George Costanza did on
Seinfeld.
On Seinfeld. And we don't get our food from a box through the mail. We cook fresh daily from local supermarkets. And I can't really stand behind any product that I personally don't use just to make $1. You know, I can't lie to our listeners and act like we do.
Right.
And we don't want to charge on Patreon for episodes without ads. I just can't see that. And quite frankly, I hate hearing ads on podcasts unless they're promoting another podcast. So with that said, if you like our podcast, you can support us by donating through PayPal or Ko-Fi on our website. You know, it keeps our podcast ad-free and it really helps us out.
Yes. So is the housekeeping done?
That it is.
All right.
I think I got that off my chest.
Okay. So what are you talking about tonight?
Well, you may not notice them at first as you walk up a rather ordinary lawn, but suddenly the hair might rise on your neck a little as you realize that you're being watched. Usually they nestle next to paving stones or carefully placed rocks. Occasionally they can be found curled up right on the ground, lying in wait. Your eyes dart around, wondering just where this one might be hiding. And as your pulse quickens, you may spot it, peering out from the leafy foliage, leering with a big fake smile between some flowering bushes. Its eyes are small and dark, topped by bushy eyebrows. Its rather rotund stomach and skinny legs are rather off-putting, even though its small stature isn't threatening at all. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's their miniature stature that really creeps you out, but not as much as the bright and rather pointy hat on its head. As you move past the unnerving humanoid creature, you can't help but feel its frozen-eyed stare watching you as you approach. And just as you pass by, out of the corner of your eye, you could swear you just saw it move.
It has a pointy hat?
Yes. People either love them or hate them, or adore them or fear them. Some even have a full-blown phobia of them. I'm talking about the Garden Gnome.
Oh my gosh. Romeo and Juliet is one of my all-time favorite movies. It's freaking brilliant.
Really, I find garden gnomes very creepy. I'm not afraid of them, but I do find them very interesting.
Huh.
But some people have a real fear of garden gnomes. They often also have a fear of dolls, which is due to the fear that a doll looks so lifelike that it might come alive. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, gnomes in European folklore are dwarfish, subterranean goblin or earth spirits who guard mines of precious treasures hidden in the earth. They are usually described as a small, physically deformed, usually hunchback creature resembling a dry, gnarled old man. Gob, the king of the gnome race, ruled with a magic sword and is said to have influenced the melancholic temperament of man. The precursor to the garden gnome can be traced all the way back to ancient Roman times. It was a common practice for ancient Romans to place statues in their gardens, most often those of various gods, in order to ward off evil spirits. The most commonly depicted was the god of vegetable gardens, vineyards, beehives, and flocks, named Priapus. When he was presented in a statue form, he was often made to look like he had dwarfism.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the 1600s, a Swiss alchemist by the name of Paracelsus introduced the idea that gnomes were one of the four elementals representing the earth. According to him, they could move through all parts of the actual earth, even rocks, but if they were exposed to water or fire, they would die. Paracelsus claimed that the gnomes must be real because they were so extensively described in the Iliad.
So if you threw water on them, would they multiply like gremlins? Don't feed them after midnight?
That I don't know. You're
doubt it.
more up on the gnome movies than I am.
Apparently, since I love Romeo and Juliet.
Right, but I do like the gremlins.
Okay, keep going.
But also in ancient Rome, the idea of hermits took off too. There is some evidence that the emperor Hadrian had a single-person hut outside of his villas that he used as a sort of solitary retreat. And it took a few years, but this idea took off. So much so that in the 1800s, people could be hired as a hermit in the garden. It was their paid job to live in a hut in someone's garden for 7 years.
What? Why? That's weird.
During that time, they were not allowed to bathe and they were not allowed to talk, and they were expected to wear druids' robes, which in a way may also be how the garden gnome statue began.
Huh.
The garden gnome, similar to what we see today, was first made in Germany by a sculptor named Greubel. He was the first to put the iconic red hat on them, known as the Phrygian cap, which was based on Greek Hellenistic hats. Gnomes are a huge part of German folklore and were said to offer assistance in the middle of the night with chores involving the garden and vegetation. In the 1800s, Sir Charles Isham brought 21 of Greubel's terracotta gnomes to the UK and planted them all over his garden at Lambton Hall. Apparently, his daughters thought the statues were either really tacky or really creepy, because they supposedly removed all of them but one. This one garden gnome remained hidden in the bushes for decades until it was finally found. It was considered the oldest garden gnome known to exist, and his nickname was Lampy. But Isham really started quite the fad, because Grable's factory went on to mass produce over 300 different styles of garden gnomes. They are more conical shaped than the rotund versions we see today, but they do have white beards and those Phrygian hats. We have Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to thank for the huge surge in brightly dressed, chubby-cheeked, garden tool-wielding gnomes that we love or hate today. The 1937 film really jump-started the modern-day version of the painted garden gnomes we've become accustomed to seeing in the U.S. But like I said at the top of my story, people really either love them or they hate them. According to Trees.com, in 2013, the Royal Horticultural Society of Britain lifted a ban on using garden gnomes at the Chelsea Flower Show, which is one of the most famous flower shows in the world. The public who are still adamantly opposed to the idea are often referred to as garden snobs or gnomophobes.
Gnomophobes.
Yeah, I like that one too. There's one group, though, that has taken the idea of garden gnomes to a completely different level. Known as the Garden Gnome Liberation Front, which began in France, it has cells all over the world.
I've heard of this. It was years ago, probably in the late 90s, but I always thought it was kind of a joke.
Well, some do operate more as pranksters, and some even have faced criminal charges.
Oh.
So basically, everyday people would go to bed with a gnome or two in their garden and wake up missing gnomes. For example, in the town of Alencon, 200 gnomes disappeared. The police later found them in a nearby forest. All the gnomes were repainted in the Garden Gnome Liberation Front's colors, blue and green. They had glasses painted on their faces, and they were covered in pasta. Can you imagine?
I want to know if it was cooked pasta or uncooked pasta, and if it was on strings like necklaces, or what's going on there.
Well, I think hard pasta would just fall off them.
Unless it was glued. I don't know.
That could be.
I don't know.
Well, I imagine the surrounding, the wildlife in that area must have loved this,
right?
Regardless if it was cooked or glued on.
Right.
The FLNJ, which is the French acronym for the group, claimed the glasses were so they could see in the dark, and the pasta was so they wouldn't go hungry. So, I don't know, do garden gnomes eat, hard pasta, or
I don't
do they
know.
prefer it cooked? In 1997, 4 men were arrested in Bethune, France, after being caught in possession of stolen gnomes and some Garden Gnome Liberation Front literature. When police searched their homes, they recovered 184 more.
Wow.
But some of the pranks seem a little more sinister, like one that happened in northern France in 1998. 11 liberated gnomes, in other words, stolen, were found hanging from a bridge by their necks with a note that said they wanted to quit this world and they joined the temple of submissive dwarfs. The gnomes, the note claimed, no longer wanted to be just decoration.
That is kind of creepy, though. I mean, if you were out walking and you saw them all hanging from that bridge, I don't know.
There are many more examples of this gnome napping throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, which resulted in many arrests, jail time, and steep fines. I thought the craze was pretty much over with, but it seems I was wrong. There are still active Liberation Front groups. As recently as 2015, a family in Colorado received an email that said their garden gnome had been liberated because the owners had not bothered to name it.
Well, how would they know? That's pretty presumptuous to assume the family hadn't named their gnome.
It is, unless someone from the group randomly struck up a conversation with the gnome owner and asked if they named it.
Well, that's kind of creepy. Some random person coming up to you and being like, have you named your gnome? And then you're like, no. And then they come back and take it.
Right.
That's just, anyway.
Better hope you got a Ring doorbell or a Blink.
Right, right.
Or any kind of good security system.
Right, because you would think that the owner could potentially ID whoever took it.
Right.
Right.
There is even a group I found for people who've had their gnome stolen. It's set up like a database where people can post descriptions and photos of their gnome nap garden statues and details about when it went missing.
Huh. So it's still a major problem. I mean, if there's this database that exists and, like, I haven't heard about it in years, but apparently it's still a problem.
Yeah, that it is. I don't care for them. I would never put one in my yard.
But you wouldn't go and take them.
I wouldn't mind putting them in people's yard that I know that they find creepy.
Well,
but
I think we've talked about that before. We have a friend that is afraid of gnomes, and we talked about getting some and putting them in their yard.
Yeah, and he was rather, off-putting by it. He didn't really care for that idea.
No, we told him about it, and we didn't do it.
But, I mean, I'd rather just kick the little monsters right over. I don't care for them. No, I don't care how cheerful they look. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm sure there's people out there, that are listeners that just love them. And
that's fine.
God bless you.
More power to you. Hey, did you know? In September of 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary set off on an expedition in Nepal. But this wasn't any ordinary mission, as evidenced by the inclusion of Marlin Perkins, the director of the Lincoln Park Zoo, in the group. Why? Because Hillary was searching for the Yeti. The well-armed group did find curious prints in the snowy mountains of Nepal. Each one about 20 to 30 inches apart. They appeared to be size 11 to 13 humanoid prints, with fallen arches and a broad instep and with a big toe that protruded inward. Hillary dismissed the prints as evidence, saying they were most likely animal prints that had been melted by the sun into what looked like much larger prints. Unfortunately, the group found no other evidence. Who'da thunk it?
So, dear, what are you talking about tonight? I assume it's not gremlins.
It's not. As promised, it's our first episode of October, and in order to celebrate, I'm going to share some of the stories we've gotten from listeners.
Oh, cool.
I know, I'm so excited. So, our first story came from Hope B. in St. Louis, Missouri, and she shared the following experience with us. She said, I have had many paranormal experiences throughout my life. Here is one of them. In 2004, I moved into a new house. My daughter was 4 years old at the time. The new house has a finished basement, and my daughter loved to play down there. One evening, I called for her for dinner by saying, "Come upstairs now." She called back up and told me not to say the word upstairs because she didn't want them knowing that there was an upstairs.
Ooh, that's creepy.
Yeah. I asked her who was the them she was talking about. My daughter replied with, "These people down here."
Oh my God, that'll make the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
I know. I get the full body shivers just reading it. Hope continued, I just figured she had imaginary friends and said, "Okay, come upstairs now for dinner." She did come up and scolded me for the upstairs thing. Later that night, we were all in bed asleep when I felt someone touching my shoulder. I rolled over thinking it was my daughter, and no one was there. This happened twice more during the night, and I thought maybe it was my husband, but he was over on his side of the bed facing away from me. I finally turned on the light and sat up, only to find no one was touching me. The next morning, my daughter told me that someone was in her room during the night touching her hair, and she then stated, "And I told you so about saying we had an upstairs." During that afternoon, my daughter called me into her room to show me her guitar. This guitar had no batteries. It was just a small child's acoustic instrument. It was in the corner playing by itself. I picked it up and held it with my palms up and open, and it continued to play. I walked out of her room, down the hall, and into the living room as it continued to play. I got rid of the guitar because my girl said, "Get it out of here." We are still in the same house, and many things have occurred here over the years. We just learned to live with it. Our spirits have been mostly benign. Now and then we get one that has to be smudged out, and we do it together. My husband has never believed in the paranormal.
Well, I wonder if he does now.
I don't know, but the whole toy playing by itself thing has always freaked me out. And when my son was little, I used to have a weird fear about the baby monitor. I never felt like the old farmhouse we lived in was haunted prior to that, but I always worried that I would hear voices through the monitor that weren't there.
Did you really?
I did, but
Well, they can pick up radio stations and things like that, and
Yeah.
they can pick up cell phones and stuff
yeah, I don't know where
if they're on the same frequency.
I don't know where the fear came from,
But I really never cared for toys with, that had batteries in the toy box because that, they would just go off sometimes for no reason. And I found that quite creepy.
yeah. But it sounded to me like Hope's family has been able to see spirits throughout the generations because she was kind enough to write in a second time with more to her story, which I thought was really cool.
Why, thank you, Hope.
Yes. So she said, "When I was a little girl, about 4 or 5, my parents and me lived in a house in Illinois off of Falling Springs Road. My grandpa built the house and several guest houses on his land. The main house was a 2-story with basement and attic. The property was large and had a big garden and many fruit trees. I loved to play in the yard, and I also had a playroom in the attic. The attic room didn't have a doorknob, but a hole in the door where the handle was supposed to be, and to open the door you had to put your finger in the hole and pull it open. The room was a really nice place. The only issue I had with it was the fact that it always seemed like someone was waiting behind the door. Once you opened the door, the feeling went away. My mother told me that she would hear me talking to someone I called Judy. I really don't remember the name Judy, but I do remember that when I went in the room to play, if I waited a little bit, someone would come to play. I always thought my parents knew I was in the playroom and sent someone to play."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's cool, but it's terrifying at the same time.
That it is.
She continued, "There were times when I saw my grandpa running across the big yard at night and yelling for people to quit driving through our yard. Later on in years, after Grandpa had passed and the property was sold, there was a road built at that end of the property where Grandpa always saw the lights. My grandpa was born in 1900. The night he was born, he was delivered by nuns that were midwives. With his birth, he had a veil over his eyes, and when removed, it was in the shape of an oak leaf. The nuns took this as a bad omen, and they burnt the veil. My grandpa had always been in touch with the spirit world all of his life. The car lights were one of his premonitions to come true. One day at a doctor appointment, my mom and me were in the waiting room, and we met a woman with a daughter my age, and we were talking with them. The girl told me about her grandmother that was also born with an oak leaf veil over her face, and that the veil was kept in a box. She also told me that her grandma saw spirits all the time. The girl's mother confirmed this, and we were all freaked out at the coincidence. The house no longer stands. There is a mortuary standing in its place. My parents said it was fitting because the house was haunted, and they remembered seeing spirits looking out the windows when they pulled into the drive. I didn't hear these tales from my parents until much older because they didn't want to scare me.
That's usually the way it goes.
Yeah. When I was 22, I had my first child. When my son was 3 years old, my dad was watching him while I went to school. When I got home, my dad was telling me that he turned out all the lights in the house except the living room so he could keep my toddler from running all over the house. What brought chills to me was what my dad told me next. He told me that my son stood at the edge of the living room, peering into the kitchen and calling out, "Judy." He reminded me of how I played with Judy, too. I know this sounds really wild, and I promise you, it is true. So it sounds like the same young spirit child that she played with was now playing with her son.
Yes, it does. And that's quite chilling.
It is chilling. So thank you, Hope, for that story.
Yes, thank you very much.
That was awesome. So our next story that I want to share tonight came to us from Sharon in Australia. And the experience she shared is actually really kind of lovely. So she wrote, "I saw your request for paranormal stories and I thought I would share this one. It's a rather nice story, really. It's about a cat that came to visit after she passed away. I like to think that it might give people some comfort about their own deceased pets because that can be a difficult thing in life. Our pets are so much a part of our families. So not a particularly spooky story, but one I hope people will like. Anyway, here it is. Princess was a rather cranky cat that lived at our neighbor's down the back. She was rather regal and did not like the fact that there was a new cat, ours, in what she considered her territory, our backyard. I understood this because she had been around a lot longer than our cat in the area. The only thing was that I had to protect our much smaller cat from her, as Princess would launch into full-on attack mode whenever she was around and spotted our cat, even right at our back door. She would launch herself full throttle at any other cat within her little kitty kingdom.
Oh, no.
I know. Despite this, I kind of liked her. There was something about her, and this stuff often is just how it goes in the cat world. It wasn't personal. She was just particularly territorial. Anyway, I hadn't seen Princess around for about 6 months. I wondered what had happened to her and thought that maybe she had passed away, knowing she was getting on in years. One day I was sitting outside enjoying a cup of tea when I saw Princess jump down off the neighbor's shed and come into our yard to sit under our big tree. She started grooming herself and sat there for a few minutes. This was a regular thing for her to do. I said hello to her, and she seemed quite content. After a while, she got up and walked around the other side of our tree where I couldn't see her. I assumed that she had gone back over the fence to her yard as per usual. I was happy to see her and that she was still with us. About a month later, I was talking to the neighbor who owned Princess and mentioned to her that I had seen her cat recently. Our neighbor, who I'll call Deborah, asked me when I had seen her. I told her about a month ago. Deb looked at me and said that Princess had passed away 6 months ago. This was a bit of a spin-out, to say the least.
Are you shitting me? Oh, my God.
Yeah. We were both a bit stunned that I had seen her, and I told Deb that she looked completely solid and normal. I had no idea she was a spirit kitty. Anyway, I told Deb that it seemed to me that Princess was letting her know that she was okay. Deb was teary-eyed and quietly said, "That's really nice." She seemed really happy to have heard that I'd seen her. The thing that really amazes me is how solid Princess looked. You would never know that she wasn't a solid physical presence unless you knew she had already passed. I have had another experience like this with a solid-looking ghost person, and I often wonder how many spirits are walking among us without us even noticing. Isn't that a great story?
That's an awesome story. I wonder what would happen if she would have tried to reach out and pet it. Would her hand went right through it?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And it's funny, that story spoke to me because you and I have both had our own ghost cat experiences. Or at least I thought mine was a cat, but it might have been a small dog. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it truly reminds me of our former cat, Momo. When he wanted to come in, he would always scratch at the outer screen door. And, it made a pretty specific sound, his nails on the screen.
Right.
But it's funny because when he had passed away, we would randomly hear that scratching on the screen door. And I'd always say, oh, Momo wants to come in.
Right.
And it was kind of comforting, but very spooky at the same time because there were no other animals.
Yeah, and there were
around.
quite a few times where we'd actually go to the door expecting there to be a cat there, and there was no cat there. Yeah, and my ghost cat or dog experience happened here in our current house. So I had gone to lay down around 7 o'clock at night because I had a headache, and I had left the bedroom door open, and I was facing the door, and one of our cats came in, and she laid down right next to my butt. And I had my eyes closed, and I felt one of our other cats jump up on the bed, cross over my feet, then walk back the other way across my feet. And then I felt her walk up from my feet to about my stomach and then lay down. And I opened my eyes to see which cat it was, and there was no cat there. And our other cat was still curled up on the other side of me. But when I leaned over to see if she was still there, she stood up and arched her back and looked at the spot where I could have sworn another cat had just laid down. And she didn't hiss exactly, but she made this really weird noise with her mouth that I'd never heard her make before. It was kind of like a warning, but it was not a hiss.
Well, those were both great stories.
They were really great stories. I appreciate them. And I knew that some of our listeners would have great experiences to share.
Yeah, and there's still 3 more episodes left in October. So if you've been holding off on emailing us, your stories, there's still time.
And like we've said, they don't have to be scary. They can be about anything you've experienced that you just couldn't explain. And you can send them to whereourmindswander@gmail.com. And another really big thank you to Hope and Sharon for the ones that I shared tonight.
Yes, thank you, Hope and Sharon. They were amazing stories.
They were great.
I love hearing other people's stories.
I do too.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for tonight's episode.
I think so.
So, we'll see you all on the next episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
We'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment. It really helps us move up the list so people can find us.
See you next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.